So let's talk a little bit about visceral fat. So we really have two different types of fat, visceral and subcutaneous. Subcutaneous fat is the fat that is right underneath your skin, and it's actually considered a healthy fat. It provides things like insulation and can actually produce certain hormones, and at a moderate body fat percentage can actually be beneficial. But visceral fat will line our organs and can sometimes impair the function of our organ systems and produce a lot of inflammatory factors, unlike this subcutaneous fat. And I realize that inflammation is kind of a blanket term that no one can really describe to you. But when I'm saying inflammatory factors, I mean specific molecules that are typically only produced in abundance in visceral fat. And this causes something similar to a low-grade immune response throughout the entire day. So now let's talk a little bit about storing and releasing this visceral fat. And a lot of it comes down to a specific hormone called cortisol. But interestingly, cortisol is kind of a double-edged sword because it can both store and release this visceral fat. Cortisol is a steroid hormone produced in response to physical and psychological stress. A psychological stress could be something like an emotional event, and a physical stress could simply just be a workout. And we've seen that emotional stress seems to increase visceral fat storage, but exercise seems to be one of, if not the most potent ways to get rid of visceral fat. And the reason for this is something that I like to refer to as fat flux. And this is simply just the movement of fat within your body. So cortisol has receptors on many of our organs and specifically on the fat cells. And there's two really major things that it does that pertain to this conversation. The first is it will actually release glucose and fat that is being stored inside of the cells. And the second is it actually increases the cell's uptake of this free glucose and free fatty acids. You see, we store fat in the form of triglycerides, but we can't directly use these triglycerides. A triglyceride is 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. So the first thing we do is we break these fatty acids off and release the glycerol molecule and the free fatty acids into the bloodstream. The glycerol molecule can be turned into glucose, which we can directly turn into energy, and the free fatty acids are available to be directly turned into energy as well. So once they're released in the form of free fatty acids and glycerol, the free fatty acids can then be reuptaken by the cells. And visceral fat seems to have the highest concentration of cortisol receptors. So in a scenario where cortisol is being released from any sort of psychological stress, we'll have increased glucose and free fatty acids being released into the bloodstream. But the muscles don't really have a reason to uptake this excess energy because there's no energy demand on the muscle. And because the visceral fat has so many of these cortisol receptors, it will be extremely sensitive to uptaking these fatty acids. You can think of it kind of like a magnetic pull. When there's a lot of free fatty acids and glucose in the bloodstream because of increased cortisol, it's kind of like we repartition these fatty acids into the visceral fat because of this much stronger magnetic pull. And obviously that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it really is the best way I've found to think about it. But let's say cortisol is released in response to a physical stressor like exercise. So when we're exercising, cortisol will increase and cause the same release of fat from visceral and subcutaneous fat stores. But we really overcome this strong pull towards visceral fat storage simply because of the increased blood flow and energy demand at the level of the working muscle. But because there's an abundance of cortisol receptors on the visceral fat, there will be a lot of fat release. But the fat that's liberated and released into the bloodstream won't really be uptaken by the visceral fat and instead will be uptaken by the muscles. So we can kind of see how cortisol can be both good and bad. We wouldn't want extremely low cortisol because we wouldn't release the fat in the first place, but we don't want chronically high cortisol as a result of mental stress, simply because the fat will end up being repartitioned towards the visceral fat stores.